This is from the website thewaythetruthandthelife.net.
The following is Obama's people in Ukraine setting up what is about to happen. The clip you're about to see is Victoria Nuland meeting the duly elected president of Ukraine, Yanukovych, who she is in the process of undermining and overthrowing.
We haven't been able to independently verify this, but this is an alleged phone call between the US Assistant Secretary of State for European Affairs, Victoria Nuland, and the US Ambassador to Ukraine, Jeffrey Pyatt, which has been posted up on YouTube. We've got no way of knowing exactly where the call came from, but it appears to be a conversation going over a plan to deal with the crisis in Ukraine. Vitaly Klitschko, who's one of the opposition leaders, is one of the first topics of conversation. Nuland and Pyatt are heard discussing whether or not he should be included in any future Ukrainian government.
So I don't think Klitsch should go into the government. I don't think it's necessary. I don't think it's a good idea.
In terms of him not going into the government, just let him sort of stay out and do his political homework and stuff. I'm just thinking in terms of sort of the process moving ahead, we want to keep the moderate Democrats together. The problem is going to be Tony Book and his guys. And, I'm sure that's part of what Yanukovych is calculating on all of this.
They go on to say that Arseniy Yatsenyuk will be prime minister and that there's no way that the two will get along.
The Klitschko piece is obviously the complicated electron here, especially the announcement of him as deputy prime minister. And you've seen some of my notes on the troubles in the marriage right now. So we're trying to get a read really fast on where he is on this stuff.
Next up comes the discussion about getting US Vice President Joe Biden and the UN involved at the right time.
Now, along with Obama, Joe Biden is bringing shame onto America.
And a son of the U.S. Vice President has joined the board of directors of Ukraine's largest private gas producer. Hunter Biden now leads the company's legal unit, getting the position a few weeks after his father's trip to Kiev. And as Marina Portnaya explains, this could be more than just a coincidence.
Since the start of the crisis in Ukraine, Washington has provided unwavering moral and financial support to anti-government protesters, particularly those who spearheaded the uprising. Over the past months, Kyiv has received special visits from the CIA director, the Secretary of State, his assistant, senators, and most recently, U.S. Vice President Joe Biden, who recently crossed the Atlantic to assure Ukrainians that America's involvement in their crisis is sincere.
We, the United States, stand with you and all the Ukrainian people. In time, democracy can be delivered to the Ukrainian people.
This is preposterous. Just after the United States was the major player in overthrowing the legitimately elected government.
It is not just a foreign policy judgment. It is it's an emotional commitment as well by millions of Americans. As you attempt to pursue energy security.
Well, as it turns out, Joe Biden's youngest son will be conveniently playing a major role in Ukraine's pursuit of energy independence. Hunter Biden has been appointed head of legal affairs at Burisma Holdings, Ukraine's largest private gas producer. The U.S. Vice President's son will also join the company's board of directors, consulting on matters related to international expansion and policies surrounding the country's economy. Critics say this is typical Washington politics, exploiting a foreign crisis for personal gain.
Now, of course, when the United States gets involved, as most every other country on earth, if they get involved in some foreign adventure, they try to portray it in the most altruistic and platonic fashion possible. However, it's very difficult to disentangle business interests from national interests.
Vice President Biden has repeatedly accused Moscow of meddling in Ukraine's affairs, also insisting that America will help Kyiv reduce its dependency on Russia's energy. Mr. Biden just didn't mention that his own son and the U.S. would be benefiting in the interim. Reporting from New York, Marina Portnaya, RT.
Hunter, however, is not the only American on Burisma's board with close ties to the U.S. government. Devin Archer joined the gas company a day after Joe Biden's visit to Ukraine. Archer was an advisor to the now Secretary of State John Kerry during his presidential campaign in 2004, and the U.S. State Department said it wasn't troubled by the appointments when the issue came up at a briefing.
I'm wondering if the State Department has any concerns or any thoughts about the Vice President's son joining the board of directors of this Ukrainian gas company.
No, he's a private citizen.
Do you consider that the Russian oligarchs who control, or the Ukrainian oligarchs who control these, they're all private citizens as well?
We certainly wouldn't put them in the same category.
No, I'm not suggesting that it should be in the same category, but I'm wondering if there are concerns from this building about the perception about how the Russians and or the Ukrainians would perceive the involvement of a son of the Vice President of the United States, especially given the situation.
No, there are not.
Help out, and a stinging comment directed at the EU for their own lack of involvement.
So that would be great, I think, to help glue this thing and have the UN help glue it. And, fuck the EU.
There's a couple of things. This does appear to show how our governments meddle in the affairs of other states, which again raises the question about whether or not we have any right at all to do that. And then there's the irony of it all, given the Edward Snowden revelations. It's apparently a conversation between very high-level US officials being listened into and leaked. There's a link to the full recording in the video description below.
Does the U.S. government believe that Russia was behind this bugging and release? And if you are not willing to go that far, are you concerned at all that officials in the Russian government seem to be wanting to point to draw attention to this?
Well, certainly we think this is a new low in Russian tradecraft in terms of publicizing, posting. I don't have any other independent details about the origin of the YouTube video. You're right. This is clearly happened overnight and is relatively new. But this is something they've been actively promoting, posting on, tweeting about, and certainly that we feel that represents a new low.
But do you think? What do you mean? Can I follow up, please?
Sure.
What do you mean by this is a new low in Russian tradecraft? Tradecraft is a word typically that refers almost exclusively to espionage activities. Are you saying that you regard this as an act of Russian espionage, that this conversation was recorded and broadcast?
Well, certainly if it was recorded and broadcast, that would be that it would be, violating a private conversation.
But you said this is a new low in Russian tradecraft. That means you think that the Russians, in fact, recorded and made available this
Well,
broadcast.
as I just stated, I don't have any independent or new information on that, but obviously they promoted this and were the first to tweet about it. So that's what I was noting.
That's your suspicion. That you didn't, you said this is a new low in Russian tradecraft. That implies that you believe it is their responsibility.
Well, I think I was pretty clear in answering Matt's question that I don't have any independent information on the origin of the YouTube video, but obviously they were the first ones to post on Twitter about it, which is an indication. But again, I don't know. Okay. I don't have any independent information.
Sorry, can I keep going? Because look, the Russians have repeatedly accused the United States government of interfering in Ukraine's politics. The U.S. government has, to some degree, made reciprocal claims about Russia. Does not the fact that U.S. diplomats purportedly are discussing who should and should not be in a Ukrainian government hint at some possibility of U.S. interference here?
Absolutely not.
Her deceit and deception makes me grievously ashamed of my government.
It should be no surprise that U.S. officials talk about issues around the world. Of course we do. That's what you do. That's what diplomats do, and discuss especially issues where we've been closely engaged. The secretary met with the opposition this weekend. He stopped by a meeting with the foreign minister. It's up to the people of Ukraine, including officials from both sides, to determine the path forward. But it shouldn't be a surprise that there are discussions about events on the ground.
This was more than discussions, though. This was two top U.S. officials that are on the ground discussing a plan that they have to broker a future government and bringing officials from the UN to kind of seal the deal. This is more than the U.S. trying to, make suggestions. This is the U.S. midwifing the process.
It is Wednesday, May 28th, and there's been so much grievous news coming out of Ukraine where the army is killing civilians.
The battle for Donetsk airport throughout Monday and early Tuesday proved costly for the separatists, with heavy loss of life. Inside one morgue, dozens of fallen rebel fighters' bodies were piled high. Denis Pushilin, the self-declared leader of the Donetsk People's Republic, said as many as 50 pro-Russian separatists and about the same number of civilians have been killed in the intense but ultimately unsuccessful fight to hold on to the air hub.
This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman.
And I'm Juan Gonzalez. Welcome to all of our listeners and viewers around the country and around the world. As negotiations over the crisis in Ukraine begin in Geneva, tension is rising in eastern Ukraine after security forces killed 3 pro-Russian separatists, wounded 13, and took 63 captive in the city of Mariupol. Ukrainian officials said the pro-Russians had attempted to storm a military base. The fighting comes just after the collapse of a Ukrainian operation to retake government buildings in several eastern towns. On Wednesday, pro-Russian separatists took control of some of their armored vehicles, and crowds surrounded another column, forcing the troops to hand over the pins from their rifles and retreat. Earlier today, Russian President Vladimir Putin accused the authorities in Kiev of plunging the country into an abyss.
People in eastern Ukraine have started to arm themselves, and instead of realizing that something bad is going on in the Ukrainian state and make any attempts to start a dialogue, the authorities have started to threaten with force even more and unleash tanks and aviation on civilian populations. This is another grave crime of the current Kiev authorities.
President Vladimir Putin speaking on Russian television earlier today. On Wednesday, NATO Secretary General Anders Fogh Rasmussen announced a series of steps to reinforce its forces in Eastern Europe because of the Ukraine crisis.
We will have more planes in the air, more ships on the water, and more readiness on the land. For example, air policing aircraft will fly more sorties over the Baltic region. Allied ships will deploy to the Baltic Sea, the Eastern Mediterranean, and elsewhere as required.
To talk more about Ukraine, Stephen Cohen is with us, Professor Emeritus of Russian Studies and Politics at New York University and Princeton University. His most recent book, Soviet Fates and Lost Alternatives from Stalinism to the New Cold War, out now in paperback. He recently wrote a piece for The Nation headlined, Cold War Again? Who's Responsible? Are we seeing the beginning of a new Cold War, Professor Cohen, and what exactly is happening right now in Ukraine?
Those are big questions. We are not at the beginning of the Cold War, a new one. We are well into it, which alerts us to the fact, just watching what you showed up there, that hot war is imaginable now. For the first time in my lifetime, my adult lifetime since the Cuban Missile Crisis, hot war with Russia. It's unlikely, but it's conceivable. And if it's conceivable, something has to be done about it. You did 2 things on your introduction which were very important. Almost alone among American media, you actually allowed Putin to speak for himself. He's being filtered through the interpretation of the mass media here, allegedly, what he said, and it's not representative. The second thing is, let us look just what's happening at this moment, or at least yesterday. The political head of NATO just announced a major escalation of NATO forces in Europe. He did a Churchillian riff. We will increase our power in the air and the sea, on the land. Meanwhile, as negotiations today began in Geneva, we're demanding that Russians de-escalate. And yet we, NATO, are escalating as these negotiations begin. So if you were to say what is going on in Ukraine today, and unfortunately the focus is entirely on eastern Ukraine, we don't have any Western media in eastern Ukraine. We don't have any Western media in Western Ukraine, the other half of the country. We're not clear what's going on there. But clearly, things are getting worse and worse. Each side has a story that totally conflicts with the other side's story.
The head of Ukraine's state TV company has been attacked and forced to resign by at least 3 MPs from the far-right Svoboda party.
The man you see beating someone in this video is part of the government, and he was not censured. No prosecution for this crime, the beating. And you could see a later clip of him involved in smashing somebody in the parliament that he's a member of. This is what Obama has supported.
They barged their way into the offices of Alexander Panteleimon, accusing him of serving Putin and being Moscow trash. They were angry that the company had broadcast the Russian parliament signing a treaty with Crimea. Ironically, the man with the ponytail is the deputy head of Ukraine's Committee on Freedom of Speech. During the Maidan anti-government protests, Panteleimon, who ran public broadcaster First National Channel, was seen by many Ukrainians as pro-Yanukovych and biased in its coverage. Ukraine's Prime Minister has condemned the assault, calling it unacceptable for a democratic society.
It seemed to me that the proposals the Russians made a month ago for resolving the conflict are at least a good starting point, but it's not clear the United States is going to accept them.
Well, Steve Cohen, it was just a few weeks ago when we had you on as the crisis was beginning to unfold in Ukraine, and a lot of what you said then turned out to be true, which was that you feared that there would be a split in Ukraine itself between the East and West, and obviously Crimea was just developing then. But it seems that all of the emphasis in the coverage here is as if the crisis started with Russian aggression, not with the earlier period of what was NATO and Europe's involvement in Ukraine before the deposing of the elected president.
Well, I think you've emphasized the absolute flaw in at least the American, because I don't follow European press very closely, the American media and political narrative. As a historian, I would say that this conflict began 300 years ago, but we can't do that. As a contemporary observer, it certainly began in November 2013, when the European Union issued an ultimatum, really, to the then elected president of Ukraine, Viktor Yanukovych, that sign an agreement with us, but you can't have one with Russia too. In my mind, that precipitated this crisis. Because why give a country that has been profoundly divided for centuries, and certainly in recent decades, an ultimatum, an elected president? Choose and divide your country further. So when we say today, Putin initiated this chaos, this danger of war, this confrontation, the answer is no. That narrative is wrong from the beginning. It was triggered by the European Union's unwise ultimatum. Now flash forward to just 1 month ago, about the time I was with you before. Remember that the European foreign ministers, 3 of them, I think, went to Kiev and negotiated with Yanukovych, who was still the president, an agreement. Now, the Russians were present at the negotiation, but they didn't sign it. But they signed off on it. They said, okay. What did that agreement call for? Yanukovych would remain president until December. Not May, when elections are now scheduled, but December of this year. Then there would be a presidential election. He could run in them or not. Meanwhile, there would be a kind of government of national accord trying to pull the government together. And importantly, Russia would chip in trying to save the Ukrainian economy. But there would also be parliamentary elections. That made a lot of sense, and it lasted 6 hours. The next day, the street, which was now a mob. It was no longer peaceful protesters, as it had been in November. It had now become something else, controlled by very ultra-nationalist forces, overthrew Yanukovych, who fled to Russia, burned up the agreement. So who initiated the next stage of the crisis? It wasn't Russia. They wanted that agreement of February, a month ago, to hold, and they're still saying, why don't we go back to it? You can't go back to it. But the point of it is that Putin didn't want And this is reality. This is not pro-Putin or pro-Washington. This is just a fact. Putin did not want this crisis. He didn't initiate it.
Let's turn to President Obama. Thursday, he was interviewed by CBS News by Major Garrett.
Is Vladimir Putin provoking a civil war there? And will you and Western leaders let him get away with that?
I think that what is absolutely clear is not only have Russians gone into Crimea and annexed it in illegal fashion, violating the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine, but what they've also done is supported, at minimum, non-state militias in southern and eastern Ukraine, and we've seen some of the activity that's been taking place there.
You left out one thing that he said, which I consider to be unwise and possibly reckless. He went on to say that Russia wouldn't go to war with us because our conventional weapons are superior. That is an exceedingly provocative thing to say, and he seems to be unaware, President Obama, that Russian military doctrine says that when confronted by overwhelming conventional forces, we can use nuclear weapons. They mean tactical nuclear weapons. I don't think any informed president, his handlers, would have permitted him to make such a statement. In fact, depending on how far you want to take this conversation about the Obama administration, I don't recall in my lifetime, in confrontations with Russia, an administration, I speak now of the President and his Secretary of State, who seem in their public statements to be so misinformed, even uninformed, both about Ukraine and Russia. For example, when Kerry testified last week to Congress that all the unrest in Ukraine was due to Putin's meddling and his provocations, he denied the underlying problem, which is divided Ukraine. I mean, everybody knows that history, God, whoever's responsible for our destiny, created a Ukraine that may have had one state but wasn't one country. It may be two, it may be three countries. But for Kerry to say that all this conflict in Ukraine is due to Putin simply makes a resolution of the problem by denying the problem. Or let me ask you a question. What in the world was the director of the American CIA doing last Sunday in Kiev? It is mind-boggling that it was called a secret mission. The real debate going on in NATO, the real debate, is what Rasmussen said in your earlier clip. He's the political head of NATO, that we're building up, as we talk, our forces in Eastern Europe. Now, understand what's going on here. When we took in, we, meaning the United States and NATO, all these countries in Eastern Europe into NATO, we agreed with the Russians we would not put forward military installations there. We built some infrastructure, airstrips, there's some barracks, stuff like that. But we didn't station troops that could march toward Russia there. Now what NATO is saying, it is time to do that. Putin, and it's not just Putin, we seem to think Putin runs the whole of the universe. He has a political class, that political class has opinions. Public support is running overwhelmingly in favor of Russian policy. Putin will compromise at these negotiations, but he will not back off if confronted militarily. He will not.
I wanted to ask you about the situation in Russia, especially the growing, some reports are that Putin's popularity has now surged about 80% of the population.
And what's going to happen in eastern Ukraine?
Well, I don't know what's going to happen, but things are getting worse and worse. People are being killed, so obviously that's bad, and we're moving closer toward a military confrontation. The Russians are asking in negotiations the following. They want NATO expansion ended to all former Soviet republics. That means Ukraine and Georgia, period. I think we should give them that. This has been a reckless, endangering policy. It's time for it to end. They want a federal Ukrainian state. That's a debate, but Ukraine is several countries. You can only hold it together with a federal constitution, and they want, in the end, a stable Ukraine, and they will contribute financially to making that possible. I don't see any reason there, other than the White House saving political face, why that's not a good negotiating position to begin with.
Well, Stephen Cohen, we want to thank you very much for being with us. Professor of Russian Studies at New York University, before that Princeton University, author of numerous books on Russia and the Soviet Union. His most recent book, Soviet Fates and Lost Alternatives from Stalinism to the New Cold War, just out in paperback. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report.
You need a little background here. Kiev was actually the capital of Russia at one time, and the Tsars moved it to Moscow to be in a safer place because there were Germanic invasions, taking slaves The word slave comes from the Germanic and Muslim taking Slavs. The word slave comes from Slav. The Germanic lords took Slavs, Russians as slaves. The Tartars took tens of thousands, murdered hundreds of thousands, took tens of thousands of Russians all the way from Moscow and sold them to Turkey and other Islamic peoples as slaves. That's part of the Quran. It's still part of the Islamic world today, if you look at what's going on in the heart of the Islamic world, Saudi Arabia. By the way, it has 2 cities that it's possible death penalty. Nobody that isn't a Muslim can enter, Mecca and Medina. And these are multi-million population modern cities. Now getting back to Ukraine, which part of it is ethnically Russian historically. It was Russian. The invasions have pushed them. But the group from the West made laws to cut off the Russian television and Russian radio. Then they're Russian speaking historically. These are ethnically Russian people. And they tried to make it illegal for them to use their language, which is historical, and cutting off television and cutting off radio. And this travesty, and that Obama is completely ignorant, and he's running policies that keep America completely ignorant, that the voice of America, I've lost complete respect for it. Not that I looked at for something about all this horror going on and murder that had been an outcome of his promoted coup and destruction of the elected government and this right sector founded oligarchy set up in there, the least of all evils, maybe, but an evil. Listen to the way the man says. He takes these civilians, people trying to live peacefully and just want to be left to be respected, and calls them murderers and terrorists, while he's murdering and terrorizing, using tanks and planes to shoot civilians, killing mothers on the street.
The battle for Donetsk airport throughout Monday and early Tuesday proved costly for the separatists, with heavy loss of life. Inside one morgue, dozens of fallen rebel fighters' bodies were piled high. Denis Pushilin, the self-declared leader of the Donetsk People's Republic, said as many as 50 pro-Russian separatists and about the same number of civilians have been killed in the intense but ultimately unsuccessful fight to hold on to the air hub. Another unconfirmed report claimed a rocket-propelled grenade hit a truck carrying wounded rebels, killing 35.
Watch in the clips to follow as the Ukrainian military with their weapons chase civilians through the woods, killing them with weaponless civilians.
Moving closer to peace or to civil war. Hours after the polls closed, pro-Russian separatists taking over the airport of the eastern city of Donetsk, government forces then flushing them out in the heaviest fighting since the crisis began. Dozens killed. That fighting, you could say it's the first order of business for oligarch Petro Poroshenko, the pro-Maidan billionaire elected in the first round. We're going to look at the tough choices ahead and where Ukraine's chocolate king stands on reconciliation with Russia and Moscow's demand for increased autonomy for the country's Russian-speaking region. Will Ukraine experience closure or civil war? With us to talk about it, Euromaidan activist Anna Garmesh. Thank you for being back with us. Thanks as well to Femin activist Ina Shevchenko. Reporter Catherine Field joins us again. Nice to see you.
Good evening.
And from Kiev, Armin Georgian is also in the Ukrainian capital. We'll be touching base with him in a moment. The France 24 debate, where you can join the conversation on Facebook and on Twitter. Our hashtag F24debate. The death toll continues to rise from the assaults triggered by Monday's takeover of Donetsk airport by separatists. France 24's Rob Parsons and James Andre witnessed Monday's fighting, the worst of Ukraine's 6-month crisis.
War stalks the leafy streets on the edge of Donetsk airport. Separatist fighters had tried to seize control of the airports during the night. Now they've been sucked into a battle for survival. Ukrainian paratroopers have arrived to reinforce the National Guard. Nerves are on edge as a rebel unit inches cautiously towards the airport. Everything is suspect, even a taxi.
If anybody had any thoughts that this conflict was going to die down after the elections, they can forget about that now. This is the first time we've seen such intense conflict so close to Donetsk. The situation is very unclear. There's been a lot of shooting all around us.
In the confusion of battle, civilians appear dazed. Ukrainian aircraft join the fight.
This is disgusting. This is horrible.
You're afraid?
Yes, I'm afraid.
Across town, more fighting. Civilians killed in a gun battle by the railway station.
There were explosions, 2 there by the flower pots and another one here, which ripped off the head of a woman. Her son was with her and he was screaming. He was cut by shell splinters.
Now, these murders may have been done by the right sector. That's a neo-Nazi group, has private army and is actually part of the government. And they have, some of their members have bragged about helping the Muslims kill Russians in Chechnya. You need to go back and understand the Muslims joined Hitler's army to kill. And there's a cooperation, hatred for Jews and hatred for communism. Well, Russia's no longer communism, but to kill a Russian still by these neo-Nazis and by the Muslims, it's a prize. And these Chechen Muslim jihadists are there helping and killing.
They were shooting all day. There were planes. What do you want me to tell you, that I'm scared? Really scared.
As night begins to fall on Donetsk and the rain clouds thicken, there's a sense here that eastern Ukraine stands on the brink of something awful. Those that have not yet given up hope are praying for a miracle.
All right, that report filed after the worst of Monday's fighting. Anna Garmesh, is Ukraine on the brink of something awful?
I really hope not. A new president has been elected, and at least, well, hopefully he will be able to bring some sort of peace. We don't really know, obviously, but at least now nobody can tell that Ukraine does not have a legitimate president or a legitimate government for that matter.
Volodymyr Ishchenko, what do you make of the timing of this fighting around Donetsk?
No, I would say that the legitimacy of Poroshenko is evident only for those regions who were actually able to vote for him. And these were not the regions of Donetsk and Lugansk, which are actually mainly controlled by the separatists. And even in those districts in Donetsk and Lugansk where the elections were possible, only a tiny minority actually came to the elections. Many people, as according to the polls made on Sunday, many people said that they actually have political reasons not to come to these elections. So actually, I really doubt that Poroshenko is seen as a legitimate president for Donbass people, and that his election will be just something to calm down them. They won't surrender because of that.
All right, at his first press conference since Sunday's vote, Petro Poroshenko ruling out any negotiations with those who took over the airport.
They just murderer. They just a bandit. They just a killer. They just a terrorist. In no civilized country of the world, nobody have a negotiation with a terrorist.
Ina Shevchenko, is that the right tone to be employing?
Well, I think that even though I will not be one of the first supporters of Poroshenko as a political personality, but I think that in such situation, fighting already for 6 months, I will remind that it's another side, it's another country intervened an independent state of Ukraine, and I think such a position is definitely correct in such a moment. This president definitely knows whatever his personal plans would be, but this president definitely knows that that the people, they will keep an eye on him like never before in history of independent Ukraine.
So for you, those that are attacking in Donetsk are foreigners?
Well, I think that it's not for me. I think that it's not me who is gonna give you some facts. I think that those facts were shared by journalists who are there, by international observers who know who are those troops, from where they sent. They're sent from Russia, from Chechnya, and I think it's.
This representative of the Ukrainian women that go naked in public to protest has some correct words, but she was given the words, but not to explain them. The explanation is that the eastern part of Ukraine is Russian, has always been Russian, and there's ethnic Russian, Ukrainian, the same blood, the same people living on both sides of the borders, relatives on both sides of the borders. I'm in southern Russia. There are many Ukrainians living here. It's she said about there being foreign fighters there. When she said Chechens, that's the Islamists that are part of the right sector hate right-wing agenda, the same background that worked to make the largest Waffen-SS group to kill Jews and Roma in Eastern Europe, and they kill Russians as part of a jihad, and then paraded as a liberation, the same way they're doing in a province of Muslims in a province in China, the same way, and it goes on until it's like the land of the seven churches, the Byzantine Empire. The Christians have all been murdered there, but those Muslims from Chechnya, from the jihad there, are in there working with the right sector and killing people. She was right there.
Clear that I think that there is no point anymore to discuss, is it a civil war between Ukrainians or it's an intervention of another country? And I think that here cannot be points. And about the previous question of you about presidential election, I think that the last comment that we just heard from Ukraine, I think it's just not actual anymore, because in fact this presidential election really showed how Ukrainian people and Ukrainian nation is united.
That was an obvious and outright lie, but at least the French channel is showing something of the news of what's going on. VOA doesn't even have it. But I'm going to go back to a February video of Professor Cohen explaining what was going to happen and who's causing it.
This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman.
And I'm Juan Gonzalez. Welcome to all of our listeners and viewers around the country and around the world. A short-lived truce has broken down in Ukraine as street battles have erupted between anti-government protesters and police. Last night, the country's embattled president and the opposition leaders demanding his resignation called for a truce and negotiations to try to resolve Ukraine's political crisis. But the truce only lasted a few hours. The last 3 days have been the bloodiest period of Ukraine's 22-year post-Soviet history. Over 50 people have died, including at least 21 today. The truce ended today when armed protesters attempted to retake Independence Square. Both sides have accused the other of using live ammunition.
To talk more about the latest in Ukraine, we're joined by Stephen Cohen, Professor Emeritus of Russian Studies and Politics at New York University and Princeton University. His most recent book, Soviet Fates and Lost Alternatives from Stalinism to the New Cold War, is now out in paperback. His latest piece in The Nation is called Distorting Russia, How the American Media Misrepresent Putin, Sochi, and Ukraine. So talk about the latest, Professor Cohen.
Where do you want me to begin? I mean, we are watching history being made, but history of the worst kind. That's what I'm telling my grandchildren. Watch this. What's happening there, let's take the big picture, then we can go to the small picture. The big picture is people are dying in the streets every day. The number 50 is certainly too few. They're still finding bodies.
I want to clarify here, the violence that they're talking about is in Kiev. It isn't the Russian-speaking people, it's the anti-Russian-speaking people that are against the government and doing this murdering.
Ukraine is splitting apart down the middle because Ukraine is not one country, contrary to what the American media, which speaks about the Ukraine and the Ukrainian people. Historically, ethnically, religiously, culturally, politically, economically, it's two countries. One half wants to stay close to Russia, the other wants to go west. We now have reliable reports that the anti-government forces in the streets, and there's some very nasty people among them, are seizing weapons in western Ukrainian military bases. So we have clearly the possibility of a civil war. And the longer-term outcome may be, and I want to emphasize this because nobody in the United States seems to want to pay attention to it, the outcome may be the construction, the emergence of a new Cold War divide between West and East, not this time, as it was for our generation, in faraway Berlin, but right on the borders of Russia, right through the heart of Slavic civilization. And if that happens, if that's the new Cold War divide, it's permanent instability and permanent potential for real war for decades to come. That's what's at stake. One last point, also something that nobody in this country wants to talk about. The Western authorities, who bear some responsibility for what's happened, and who therefore also have blood on their hands, are taking no responsibility. They're uttering utterly banal statements which, because of their vacuous nature, are encouraging and rationalizing the people in Ukraine who are throwing Molotov cocktails, now have weapons, are shooting at police. We wouldn't permit that in any Western capital, no matter how righteous the cause. But it's being condoned by the European Union and Washington as events unfold.
He's talking now about the anti-Russian speaking Ukrainian population. Like he said, Ukraine really isn't one nation. It's two nations, and it has been. It used to be a Russian nation in ancient history, but it's been gradually taken over. But where is the United States going to end up with anything but disgracing itself through this Obama regime? It did the same type of thing through Clinton with Kosovo, where they're now training jihadists.
And when you say the Western countries who bear some responsibility, in what sense do they bear responsibility? I mean,
it's hard to deny. But as for the immediate crisis, let's ask ourselves this. Who precipitated this crisis? The American media says it was Putin and the very bad, though democratically elected, president of Ukraine, Yanukovych. But it was the European Union, backed by Washington, that said in November to the democratically elected president of a profoundly divided country, Ukraine, you must choose between Europe and Russia. That was an ultimatum to Yanukovych. Remember, wasn't reported here, at that moment, what did the much despised Putin say? He said, why? Why does Ukraine have to choose? We are prepared to help Ukraine avoid economic collapse, along with you, the West. Let's make it a tripartite package to Ukraine, and it was rejected in Washington and in Brussels. That precipitated the protests in the streets. And since then, the dynamic that any of us who have ever witnessed these kinds of struggles in the streets unfolded as extremists have taken control of the movement from the so-called moderate Ukrainian leaders.
Let's go to President Obama. He's in Mexico for the big Mexico-Canada-U.S. summit, talking about Ukraine.
With regard to Ukraine, along with our European partners, we will continue to engage all sides, and we continue to stress to President Yanukovych and the Ukrainian government that they have the primary responsibility to prevent the kind of terrible violence that we've seen, to withdraw riot police, to work with the opposition to restore security and human dignity and move the country forward. And this includes progress towards a multi-party technical government that can work with the international community on a support package and adopt reforms necessary for free and fair elections next year. Ukrainians are a proud and resilient people who've overcome extraordinary challenges in their history, and that's a pride and strength that I hope they draw on now.
That's President Obama in Mexico, Professor Cohen.
What are you asking me to comment on?
Your response to his
response.
response.
What he just said, shame. Shame. He is saying that the responsibility for restoring peace is on the Ukrainian government, and it should withdraw its security forces from the streets. But let me ask you, if in Washington, people throwing Molotov cocktails are marching on Congress, and these people are headed for the Ukrainian Congress, if these people have barricaded entrance to the White House and are throwing rocks at the White House security guard, would President Obama withdraw his security forces? This is, and you know what this does? And let's escape partisanship here. I mean, lives are at stake. This incites these kinds of statements that Obama made. It rationalizes what the killers in the streets are doing. It gives them Western license, because he's not saying to the people in the streets, stop this, stop shooting policemen, stop attacking government buildings, sit down and talk. And the guy you had on just before, a so-called moderate leader, what did he just tell you? We have lost control of the situation. That's what I just told you. He's just confirmed that. So what Obama needs to say is, we deplore what the people in the streets are doing when they attack the police, the law enforcement official. And we also don't like the people who are writing on buildings, Jews live here. Because these forces, these quasi-fascist forces, let's address this issue, because the last time I was on your broadcast, you found some guy somewhere who said there was none of this there. All right, what percent are the quasi-fascists of the opposition? Let's say they're 5%. I think they're more, but let's give them the break, 5%. But we know from history that when the moderates lose control of the situation, they don't know what to do, the country descends in chaos. 5% of a population that's tough, resolute, ruthless, armed, well-funded, and knows what it wants can make history. We've seen it through Europe. We've seen it through Asia. This is a reality. And where Washington and Brussels are on this issue, they won't step up and take their responsibility.
My fellow Americans, that's what's happened in Ukraine now. Here in Russia, near the Ukrainian border, there is no difference. The Ukraine has been Russian-speaking Russians forever. And the border was like didn't exist. There are relatives on both sides of the border that they are grieving now because the terrorists are coming in there, killing on the streets. And it's hard to tell who's a terrorist and who isn't, because they look the same. Because they've got the right sector, that's the neo-Nazis and their helpmates, the Islamists from Chechnya that they've worked with, and it's a terrorism. There's terrible things going on, and Obama is responsible. I'm so ashamed of my country.
Well, even in our most recent history, whether you look at Libya or whether you look at the situation in Syria, where those presidents warned that there were extremist elements inside a broader popular movement that were eventually going to gain control. This seems like a replay in terms of what's going on here in the Ukraine, of a popular movement, but yet a very, very, as you say, right-wing movement. Not only a right-wing movement, but a fascist movement with a history. Ukraine has had a history of a fascist movement going back to the days of Nazi Germany.
Let's go to real heresy. Let's ask a question. who's been right about interpreting recent events? Let's go to the Arab Spring. Obama in Washington said this is about democracy now. This is great. Russia said, wait a minute. If you destabilize, even if they're authoritarian leaders in the Middle East, you're not going to get Thomas Jefferson in power. You're going to get jihadists. You're going to get very radical people in power all through the Middle East. Looking back, who is right or wrong about that narrative? Have a look at Egypt. Have a look at Libya. Who was right? Can Russians ever be right about anything? Now what are the Russians saying about Ukraine? They're saying what you just said, that the peaceful protesters, as we keep calling them, I think a lot of them have gone home. There were many. By the way, at the beginning, there were hundreds of thousands, tens of thousands of very decent, liberal, progressive, honorable people in the streets. But they've lost control of the situation. That's the point now. And so the Russians are saying, look, you're trying to depose Yanukovych, who's the elected government. Think, if you overthrow, and by the way, there's a presidential election in a year. The Russians are saying, wait till the next election. If you overthrow him, and that's what Washington and Brussels are saying, that he must go, what are you doing to the possibility of democracy not only in Ukraine, but throughout this part of the world? And secondly, who do you think is going to come to power? Please tell us. And we're silent.
I want to go to the famous leak tape right now. The top State Department official has apologized to her European counterparts after she was caught cursing the European Union, the EU, in a leaked audio recording that was posted to YouTube. The recording captured an intercepted phone conversation between the U.S. ambassador to Ukraine, Jeffrey Pyatt, and Victoria Nuland, the top U.S. diplomat for Europe. Nuland expresses frustration over Europe's response to the political crisis in Ukraine using frank terms.
So that would be great, I think, to help glue this thing and have the UN help glue it. And, you know, the EU.
While Assistant Secretary of State Victoria Nuland's comment about the EU dominated the news headlines because she used a curse, there were several other very interesting parts of her conversation with the U.S. ambassador to Ukraine.
Let me work on Klitschko, and if you can just keep, I think we want to try to get somebody with an international personality to come out here and help to midwife this thing. And then the other issue is some kind of outreach to Yanukovych, but we probably regroup on that tomorrow as we see how things start to fall into place.
So on that piece, Jeff, when I wrote the note, Sullivan's come back to me, VFR, saying you need Biden, and I said probably tomorrow for an attaboy and to get the deeds to stick. So Biden's willing.
That's the U.S. ambassador to Ukraine, Pyatt, speaking with Victoria Nuland. The significance of what she is saying. She also had gone to Ukraine and was feeding protesters on the front line.
Cookies. Well, here again. The American political media establishment, including the right and the left and the center, because they're all complicit in this nonsense, focused on the two sensational, they thought, aspects of that leaked conversation. She said, F the European Union. And everybody said, oh my God, she said the word. The other thing was, who leaked it? Oh, it was the Russians. Those dirty Russians leaked this conversation. But the significance is what you just played. What are they doing? The highest-ranking State Department official, who presumably represents the Obama administration, and the American ambassador in Kiev are, to put it in blunt terms, plotting a coup d'etat against the elected president of Ukraine. Now, in Washington and Brussels, they lie. They're talking about democracy now. They're not talking about democracy now. They're talking about a coup now.
Well, this is more from...
And we American citizens should be allowed to choose which policy we want, but they conceal it from us. And I'm extremely angry that the people in this country who say they deplore this sort of thing have fallen silent.
Let's listen to a little bit more of the leaked conversation between the U.S. ambassador to Ukraine, Jeffrey Pyatt, and Victoria Nuland, the top U.S. diplomat for Europe.
Good. So I don't think Klitsch should go into the government. I don't think it's necessary. I don't think it's a good idea.
Yeah, I mean, I guess you think, in terms of him not going into the government, just let him sort of stay out and do his political homework and stuff. I'm just thinking, in terms of sort of the process moving ahead, we want to keep the moderate Democrats together. The problem is going to be Tony Book and his guys. And, you know, I'm sure that's part of what Yanukovych is calculating on all of this.
I think Yats is the guy who's got the economic experience, the governing experience. He's the guy, you know, what he needs is Klitsch and Tony Book on the outside. He needs to be talking to them 4 times a week, you know. I just think Klitsch going in, he's going to be at that level working for Yatsenyuk. It's just not going to work.
That was Victoria Nuland, the top U.S. diplomat for Europe, speaking with Jeffrey Piat, the U.S. ambassador to the Ukraine. Stephen Cohen, this chess game that they're conducting here.
Explain the names. Who is Klitsch? Yats.
All right. And notice the intimacy which with the Americans deal with the 2 leading so-called modern, and these are big shots, they both want to be president, Ukrainian opposition. Klitschko is Vitaly Klitschko, a 6'8" former. He resigned his title 2 months ago to enter politics, heavyweight champion of the world. His residence has been Germany. He pays taxes in Germany. He's a project of Merkel. He represents German interest. I'm sure he's also faithful to Ukraine, but he's got a problem. Yatsenyuk, or not Yatsenyuk, but the guy she calls Yats, is the representative of the Fatherland Party. It's a big party in Parliament, but Washington likes him a lot. They think he'll be our man. So you could see what they're saying. We don't quite trust Klitschko. Now, if you want to get esoteric, that's the tug between Washington and Berlin. They're not happy with Merkel, the Chancellor of Germany. They don't like the role Merkel's playing generally. They think Germany's gotten too big for its britches. They want to cut Merkel down. So you notice Klitschko, the boxer, is Merkel's proxy, or at least she's backing him. You notice what they say. He's not ready for prime time. Let him do his homework. Now, this guy, I'm bad on Ukrainian names, Yatsenyuk, that they say has got to play a role. He's the leader of the Freedom Party, the Svoboda Party, but a large element of that party, to put it candidly, is quasi-fascist. And they're prepared to embrace this guy. This is the guy, by the way, that Senator John McCain in November or December went to Kiev and embraced. Either McCain didn't know who he was or he didn't care. The United States is prepared to embrace that guy, too. Anything to get rid of Yanukovych, because they think this is about Putin. That's all they really got on their mind.
And yet here you have President Obama, again, speaking yesterday in Mexico.
The United States is not to see these as some Cold War chessboard in which we're in competition with Russia. Our goal is to make sure that the people of Ukraine are able to make decisions for themselves about their future, that the people of Syria are able to make decisions without having bombs going off and killing women and children, or chemical weapons, or towns being starved because a despot wants to cling to power.
Who benefits from the instability, Professor Cohen, in Ukraine, and what does it mean for Putin? Is he concerned about this?
Of course he's concerned. It's right on his borders, and it's all tainting him. I mean, the Washington Post wrote an editorial yesterday. Putin is happy that the violence has broken out in the streets. Everybody understands, even the Washington Post understands, which understands almost nothing about Russia, but they got this, that during the Sochi Olympics, the last thing Putin wants is violence in Ukraine. So why is he happy about it? He deplores it. He's unhappy. He's furious at the president of Ukraine. He read him the riot act on the phone last night, that why doesn't he get control of the situation? What is he doing? So Putin's not responsible for this. Can we speak about Obama?
Very quickly.
Very quickly. I grew up in the segregated South. I voted for him twice as historical justice. That's not leadership. That's a falsification of what's happening in Ukraine. And it's making the situation worse. What he says is that we deplore the violence and call upon the Ukrainian government to withdraw its forces and stop the violence. He needs to talk about what's happening in the streets.
The U.S. can hardly protest, given the whole scandal with the NSA recording
They said, when this got leaked, that this is a low point in statecraft. After Snowden, I mean, what did Tennessee Williams used to say? Mendacity? Mendacity? The mendacity of it all? Don't they trust us, our government, to tell us a little bit of the truth at last?
Stephen Cohen, I want to thank you for being with us. So we're going to move on to Venezuela. Stephen Cohen is Professor Emeritus of Russian Studies and Politics at New York University and Princeton University. His most recent book, Soviet Fates and Lost Alternatives from Stalinism to the New Cold War. It's just out in paperback. His latest piece in The Nation is Distorting Russia, How the American Media Misrepresent Russia, Sochi, and Ukraine. This is Democracy Now! Back in a minute.
Armin Georgian, what's the view in Kiev today on how Petro Poroshenko so far is handling this worst fighting again we've seen since the crisis began that's taking place around Donetsk?
Well, just a very quick reaction first to what Anna Garmash was saying there about foreign fighters. I do actually have some details on that because I was listening to a press conference a little while ago in this very building where I am, given by Vladislav Seleznyov, who is the spokesperson for this anti-terrorist operation, as Kiev calls it. And he did confirm that, according to his information, there are fighters from the Caucasus in the east. He didn't explicitly mention Chechens. He didn't mention that they may be sent by Mr. Kadyrov.
Using this name, Kadyrov, is one of the most evil things I could think of. Yes, there are people from the Caucasus, the Muslims that are allied with the right sector and the Ukrainian neo-Nazis. Kadyrov is their enemy. He's a Sufi Muslim, not one of the jihadists. The jihadists killed his father. So, yes, there are Muslims coming to help terrorize the Russian-speaking Ukrainians.
That's obviously been the speculation, but he certainly does say that there are fighters from the Caucasus here. To answer your question about Poroshenko, I haven't seen really from talking to people today anyone's really being very anything other than a great sense of foreboding. Although he did get this very impressive in many ways result in the very first round, I didn't get a sense of people being gung-ho at all or saying, yes, you've got to go in there and kill the terrorists. Nothing like that. They were just very somber. I was talking to people on Maidan, the square just behind me earlier in the day, and they were saying this is very, very bad what's happening in the east, even though obviously they do understand that there's a price to pay if Petro Poroshenko is to eventually restore the government's control in the east of the country.
Let's give you a couple of international reactions. U.S. President Barack Obama sending a phone call of congratulations to the newly elected president of Ukraine. The Kremlin warning Kiev this Tuesday against the use of force, a warning echoed by the Russian foreign minister who spoke in the company of his Turkish counterpart.
If they are counting on suppressing resistance in the southeast with the help of a heavily armed army, the National Guard, right sector and the rest, before Poroshenko's expected inauguration and supposedly victorious visit, I don't think that this will create good conditions for a warm welcome in the Donetsk region. The military action has to be stopped immediately.
Catherine Field, what's your reaction there to the words of Sergei Lavrov?
I think the military action does have to be stopped. It was necessary to clear the airport, but there does have to be negotiations. You cannot have so many rebels or opponents without talking to them. The gun is not the way to solve this. It's just on such a knife edge at the moment, it could go either way, and really going in heavy-handed, even tougher, is going to be even harder then to pull back.